Hey, I'm Zach. I'm the lead pastor here at Restore. Thanks so much for checking out this week's video. I hope that it encourages you, I hope that it inspires you, and I hope that it causes you to dive deeper into God's Word. I also hope that you have some community around you that you can talk through some of these things with. And I want to remind you that we are in the middle of our year in the story, which is really this deep dive into God's great story and our place in it. If you'd like more information about that or about our community here at Restore, you can get that all on our website at restoreaustin.org. We really would love to see you soon. Thanks.
My freshman year in college, I took an introduction to modern art class. I'd spent most of my high school years partying and playing football, and there wasn't much art involved in those years. But I was in college now. It was time to get a little more sophisticated, and so, hey, I'm gonna enroll in an introduction to modern art class. And on our first day, I remember my professor put a picture of this painting up on the projector. Does anyone know what this is? Starry Night. Vincent van Gogh. Very nice. Such a great painting. I remember our professor telling us to take a minute and absorb Van Gogh's beautiful work just in silence. Just look at it, just let it speak to you. And then after a couple of minutes, she asked, "What do you take away from this painting?" I remember people saying things like, "It illustrates the richness of light in a dark sky. It captures the quietness of a small town. It displays the beauty of colors across hills at night." Do you know what no one said? No one said, "It tells me exactly how many stars are in the sky." No one said, "It explains the wind patterns in southern France." No one said, "It gives me the correct dimensions of the moon." Nobody said that. And if they had, the professor would have been quick to point out that the purpose of Van Gogh's masterpiece is not a lesson in astronomy or meteorology. That's not what he's trying to do here. No matter your level of art expertise, we all look at a painting like that and we intuitively understand that Van Gogh is not trying to enumerate the stars. He's not trying to explain the science behind the wind. He's attempting to capture the beauty of a starry night. It's a painting. It's not a textbook. If we ask The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh, how many stars are in the sky? Or how big is the moon? We are asking it questions that is simply not trying to answer. And it may seem ridiculous to treat something like a textbook that so obviously is not a textbook. But this is exactly what we've done with Genesis chapter 1 over the last few hundred years. We've asked it questions like, how old is the earth? How long did it take God to create the world? Where is the Garden of Eden? Did God use evolution? When did dinosaurs live? Or did they? All of these questions matter, and hear me, all of these questions are worth talking about, but what I desperately want us to understand is that Genesis 1 is not trying to answer any of these questions. Genesis 1 is not a textbook. It's not a scientific or literal or historical retelling of creation. Even if we completely disregard things like the fossil record, things like carbon dating or molecular biology, all we have to do is look at the text itself to see that it makes no attempt to be literal or scientific or historical. For example, the first 3 days all conclude with the phrase, "There was evening and there was morning," the first day. There was evening and there was morning the second day. There was evening and there was morning the third day. And then look at how the fourth day begins, Genesis 1:14. "And God said, 'Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years.'" The lights that served to mark days, that distinguished day from night, didn't exist until day 4. But days 1 through 3 said that there was evening and there was morning after each of them, but there is no evening and morning without the sun and the moon and the stars. Another example is found in verse 6. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. This verse reflects this ancient understanding of where rain came from. So for thousands of years, people believed that there was this huge water storehouse above the sky, that periodically the storehouse doors would open up, and that was where rain came from. Today, we know that rain comes from steam, right? Steam that rises and forms clouds, and clouds get too heavy, and then rain falls to the earth. We know there is no storehouse of water above the sky. Another example is found in day 7. So after 6 days of creating the world and everything in it, it says that God uses the 7th day to rest from his work. He's tired. He takes a break. If we really believe that God is truly God, this simply cannot be literal. If God is God, he doesn't need to rest. He doesn't get tired. He's not bound by our constraints of tiredness. It doesn't work like that. He doesn't become tired. This is figurative language. One last example is found in the order of creation described in Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2. Let's look first at Genesis 1, starting in verse 11. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the 3rd day. That's day 3 as recorded in Genesis 1:11. Now Genesis 2 starting in verse 5. Now no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface on the ground. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. In Genesis 2, God makes man before any shrub or plant appears on the earth. But in Genesis 1, the plants are created in day 3, and humanity is created in day 6. Genesis 1 makes no claim to be historical, to be scientific, or to be a literal retelling of creation. Genesis 1 makes no attempt to answer the vast majority of the questions that we have become obsessed with asking it. Not only that, nobody was even asking these scientific method-related questions about creation or the Bible in general until the Enlightenment. These questions that we so often struggle with and trip over and walk away from our faith about weren't even being asked until around the 19th century. Old Testament scholar Peter Enns puts it like this: "It is a fundamental misunderstanding of Genesis to expect it to answer questions generated by a modern worldview, such as whether the days were literal or figurative, or whether the days of creation can be lined up with modern science, or whether the flood was local or universal. The question that Genesis is prepared to answer is whether Yahweh, the God of Israel, is worthy of worship." I firmly believe that not only are we asking Genesis 1 the wrong questions, I believe we have so plucked it out of its context, ignored its genre, and applied our 21st century Western expectations to it that we have completely missed the point of it. We've completely missed the point. To borrow a line from another pastor, in the beginning, we misunderstood. But guess what? It doesn't have to be this way. Because here's the thing, and I want you to like lean in and listen really closely, because I don't want us to miss this. Genesis 1 is so much better than a scientific explanation of how the world was created. Genesis 1 is so much more than a commentary on the age of the earth. It's better than that. Genesis 1 is a portrait of God's majesty. It's an explanation of his purpose for the world and everything in it, and it's a beautiful picture of his great love for us. So instead of asking Genesis 1 all the wrong questions, things like what and how and when and where, let's ask it the questions it's actually trying to answer. Who and why? That's how we're going to break it down this morning with the rest of our time together. We're going to ask Genesis 1, who and why. Here we go. You ready? I'm excited if you can't tell. Let's start with the who. The first who we need to look at are the who wrote it and the who received it. So the author and the audience. Both the Old Testament and New Testament attribute the first 5 books of the Bible to Moses. So that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They're commonly called the Torah or the Pentateuch. So Moses' authorship of these 5 books was generally accepted as fact by both Jew and Christian for thousands of years, really up until a few hundred years ago. But now scholars are a little bit divided on who they think wrote it. Without delving too deeply into it, I believe the evidence supports Moses as the source of most of the Torah, the source of most of the first 5 books of the Bible, including the vast majority of Genesis. I also believe the Torah as we have it came together probably around the 5th or 6th century BC using a handful of resources. So for our purposes today, I'm going to conclude that Moses wrote Genesis and that he wrote it to the Israelites. I also believe that he wrote this portion of Genesis right after God used him to free the Israelite people from slavery in Egypt. Do you remember this story? So Abraham is kind of the beginning of this people of Israel, God's people. So he's called out by God to be the father of his people. God says, go to a land that I will show you. Abraham leaves everything he's ever known. He goes to this land. He starts this family of God. So Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Now you may have heard this faith called the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That's where this comes from. It's the lineage. Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. And then Jacob has 12 sons. It would eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. And one of these sons is a guy named Joseph. And Joseph is Jacob's favorite. Jacob just loves him the most. He even gets him the Technicolor dream coat, right? The coat of many colors. And he wears it around. His brothers are jealous. He's having these crazy dreams where his brothers are really subservient to him, and his brothers get upset. They don't like him, and so they pretend to kill him. They put blood all over the coat of many colors. They turn it back to Jacob, and they're like, your son is dead, and they sell him into slavery in Egypt. But then God starts moving in Joseph's life in like amazing ways. And he goes from actually being in jail for a portion of time in Egypt to rising up to becoming Pharaoh's right-hand guy, like number 2 in the entire country of Egypt. He's over basically everything. Well then, all of the family of God, these Israelites, Jacob and his 12 sons, they start to struggle because a famine hits the land. And they hear that there's food in Egypt. They don't know that Joseph's there, but they hear there's food in Egypt. So they travel to Egypt. They get there, and who's there to greet them but their long-lost little brother Joseph? Joseph shows them amazing grace. He welcomes them into the family. He gives them food, and the people of God, the Israelites, settle in Egypt. And they're in Egypt for a few hundred years. First as kind of ordinary guests, but later on, long after Joseph has died, there's a new Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's a little bit uncomfortable with how quickly the Israelites are having children. They're populating very, very fast, and he fears that their numbers are going to take over the Egyptians, and so he puts them all in slavery. So all the Israelites become slaves. Then God uses Moses to free the Israelites from slaves in Egypt. You might remember he sends the plagues, he parts the Red Sea, he says, let my people go, that whole thing, right? So he frees them from slavery in Egypt. Now, during their time in Egypt, the people of Israel would have been immersed in Egyptian language and culture and religion, right? Because for the Egyptians, like every other culture at the time, their religion was intertwined with every part of their lives. Like everything they did had this kind of spiritual undertone to it. So Israelites would have been needed to be well-versed in Egyptian religion to survive just day to day in Egypt. This means the Israelites would have been combining worship of their God, Yahweh, as he's called in Hebrew, and the worship of Egyptian gods into kind of one syncretized religion. And this syncretized religion, it's not easy to shake. It stays with them for a long time. We actually see later in the Old Testament book of Joshua that the Israelites still have idols for these Egyptian gods hundreds of years later. So the Israelites are living in Egypt for a few hundred years, first as guests, then as slaves, and they're worshiping some combination of Yahweh and Egyptian gods in an attempt to survive, when all of a sudden they find themselves freed from slavery and walking through the desert led by Moses. Now, during this time, the people of Israel are constantly struggling to free themselves of Egyptian influence. A few years in, after wandering around the desert, they tell Moses, I don't even want to be a free person anymore. I don't know who this Yahweh God is. He parted the Red Sea for us, but he hasn't done much for us since. Let's just go back to Egypt. Let's just go be slaves again. At least we knew that we had a hot meal back then. Let's just go back. Moses is like, no, let's keep going. Let's trust him. Moses leaves for a little while. He goes up on the mountain. He gets the 10 commandments from God. He's got the big stone tablets. He's coming down the mountain. Remember what he sees when he gets down? The golden calf. He's gone for like 15 minutes. The people of Israel are like, let's build a calf just like we had in Egypt and let's worship that, because that seems better than this God Yahweh who hasn't really done that much for us in a while. They're constantly struggling to tear their worship of Yahweh apart from Egyptian and other ancient Near Eastern gods of the time. And as their leader, Moses knows. He knows that he has to call them back to the one true God. He has to reintroduce them to the supremacy of Yahweh over the Egyptian gods, over all of the other Mesopotamian and ancient Near Eastern gods that existed at the time. So what does he do? He starts writing Yahweh's story. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Moses begins by going back to the very beginning. You see, he believes that reminding the Israelites of Yahweh's supremacy over all these other gods is best accomplished by telling a creation story. Every religion has creation stories. Every God has their version of how the world was formed. Every God has their version of their role in creation. And one of the most prominent creation stories comes from the ancient Near East, and it's called the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish. And many of the original manuscripts for the Enuma Elish were found in 1849 in Iraq, and they date back as much as 1,000 years before the writing of Genesis. And to show you a little bit of what I'm talking about, I want to read you a few excerpts from the Enuma Elish. We'll start in chapter 1, verse 1. When the heavens above did not exist, and the earth beneath had not come into being, there was the god called Apsu, the firstborn, their begetter, and the god Tiamat, who gave birth to them all. They had mingled their waters together before meadowland had coalesced and reed bed was to be found, when not one of the gods had been formed or had come into being, when no destinies had been decreed, the gods were created within them. In pure Apsu was Marduk born. Marduk, you are the most honored among the great gods. Marduk fashioned heavenly stations for the great gods and set up constellations and the patterns of the stars. He appointed the year, marked off the divisions, and set up 3 stars each for the 12 months. He made the crescent moon appear and entrusted night to it and designated it the jewel of the night to mark out the days. He said, let me put blood together and make bones too. Let me set up primeval man. Man shall be his name. I will create man on whom the toil of gods will be laid that they may rest. So he created mankind from his blood, on whom he imposed the service of the gods and set the gods free. That's what Moses is up against. That's kind of the prevailing understanding of the time. There's some similarities, right? You kind of hear them in there. Similarities with Genesis 1. Apsu, Marduk, and other ancient Near Eastern gods are exactly who Moses is opposing, exactly who he's trying to separate their worship of Yahweh from. So he uses Genesis 1 to tell a different creation story, familiar enough to identify with the story of the pagan gods, but directly opposing their story in some really key areas. So in verse 1, he says, yes, the heavens and the earth were made, but not by Apsu, not by Marduk. They were made by God. In verse 14, he says, yes, the sun and the moon and the stars govern the day and the night, but they aren't gods themselves. They were created by Yahweh. In verse 26, he says, yes, humanity was created, but not to relieve the gods of their toil, but to join in with the one true God in his work and with his image. I love how the Genesis scholar Gordon Wenham says it. He says, an ancient Near Easterner from outside Israel encountering Genesis 1 for the first time would be particularly struck by the difference between the theology of Genesis and the usual ancient Near Eastern beliefs. Here in Genesis, we meet just one all-powerful God who speaks and what he commands comes to pass. Not a multitude of competing gods and goddesses, each with his or her own sphere of influence. Also, unlike most Oriental divinities, this God views the creation of mankind as the summit, the peak of divine creativity, not a mere incident in the history of the world. Moses continues like this throughout Genesis 1, elevating Yahweh above the other gods, separating their creation story from the creation stories that were prevailing during the time. 7 days filled with rebuttals, 7 parts of a masterfully written argument. Moses is going after these other gods. And the number 7 is incredibly important. Not necessarily because it tells us the literal number of days, but because the number of 7 is used throughout the Bible to represent completion and perfection. To Moses' Israelite audience, this 7-part creation account would have pointed them to Yahweh's perfection and pointed them to his ability to complete creation all by himself. He didn't discuss it with the other gods. He didn't have input. He just did it. He's all powerful. He is almighty. He is perfect. He is complete. Moses' creation story is also highly structured. It's bookended by an introduction in Genesis 1, 1 and 2, and a conclusion in Genesis 2, 1 through 3. You don't have to look closely to see that the 6 days of creation are actually paired up as well. So I want to put it on the screen, and I can show you what I'm really talking about here. So you have Genesis 1, 1 and 2. This is the introduction. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The conclusion, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. Then in day 1, you have light created. Day 4, you have lights created. Day 2, sky and sea. Day 5, the things that live in the sky and sea, the birds and the fish. Day 3, the land and the plants. Day 6, the things that live there, humanity, the things that eat the plants, the animals. It's this highly structured thing, an introduction, parallel days, and a conclusion. Moses even makes the days themselves rhythmic, right? He starts each one with the phrase, and God said. He centralizes each one with the phrase, it was good. And then he concludes each one with the phrase, and there was evening and there was morning. It's all there. Perfect structure, beautiful imagery, repetition, rhythm, meter, and powerful arguments against the gods at the time. You see, at its core, Genesis 1 is a highly structured poem, directly confronting other gods and their creation stories. It's like the most beautiful position paper ever written. Moses just goes after these other gods. He is so desperate. I mean, think of him like the pastor of these wandering Israelites who cannot separate themselves from their hundreds of years of influence with these other gods, right? They're still building golden calves. They're still asking to go back to Egypt. They're still worshiping these created things, and he's like, you're missing it. You're missing it. You're worshiping the creation. You're not worshiping the creator. And so like a pastor, his heart is broken for his people, and he wants to lead them to elevate Yahweh, the one true God. At its core, Genesis 1 is this highly structured poem directly confronting the gods and their creation stories. Now, if you have always struggled with this story because you feel like it doesn't really harmonize with science or history, what I just said is probably incredibly freeing for you. And I'm hopeful for that, and I'm glad for that. But if you've grown up believing and defending this story as a literal or scientific retelling of creation, what I just said is kind of hard to swallow. I get that. I understand that. I empathize with that. I really do. But you have to grab what you have to grab a hold of here is that correctly understanding what Genesis 1 really is and what it's actually trying to do makes this passage more powerful, not less powerful. It makes it more reflective of God's glory, not less. This passage in particular and the Bible as a whole are so much better when we stop trying to turn them into something it's not and start appreciating it for what it actually is. It's so much better. I promise you, it's better. It's better because we get to stop asking the Bible questions it doesn't answer. It's better because we get to stop trying to make it fit our finite understanding of the world. It's better because we get to stop asking it to be something that it never claimed to be and fall in love with it for what it is. A true story about the one true God, about his love and his grace and his glory. That's what this is. It's better. It's more. At the beginning, I said we were going to ask Genesis why and who. We've talked a lot about the why. We've mentioned some of the who's, but we've saved the most important who for last. The main character of this story. The main character of the whole book of Genesis. The entirety of the Bible is about God. He is the main character. He is the focal point. First and foremost, this story is about him. It's about his majesty and his glory and his supremacy. It's about his grace and his mercy and his love, his great love for me and for you and for the Israelites and for every single person who has ever lived. Moses spills the bulk of his ink in Genesis 1 talking about who God is and what he has done. He starts out, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. From the jump, Moses leaves no doubt about who created the world. It's not Marduk, it's not Apsu, it's not some random chance, it's God. He created it. In the beginning, he did it. In other creation stories, the gods are fighting with each other to determine who is in control, who gets to decide, who gets to create this, who gets to create that, but not here. In Genesis 1, Moses shows that Yahweh has always been and will always be in control of all things. All of heaven and earth are under his command. Verse 3 says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. There is no negotiation. There is no conversation. No one else speaks into this. No one else gives their opinions. Our God speaks, and his will is done. He said, let there be light, and there was light. Not only is our God the creator, he is also the assigner of purpose. I love this. He tells the land, produce vegetation. The sun and the moon are tasked with separating the day from the night. Water is commanded to teem with fish, and the land is directed to house the animals. And as these purposes are handed out by our great God, they are met with two decisive responses. It was so, and it was good. It was so, and it was good. What incredible power. My friends, when our God speaks, it is always so, and it is always good. Finally, God finishes creation with his crowning achievement, mankind. Verse 26, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. This idea of being made in God's image is unique to humanity. It's also unique to this creation story from Genesis 1. You see, in other creation stories, mankind is made without care, without being thought of, without being planned out. We're completely expendable to these other gods. There's this crazy story about Marduk and Apsu where the humanity down below that they've created to kind of relieve them of all their toil is like acting up. They're being annoying. They're like, parties are too loud. And so the gods get mad and they just lightning bolt, like all of them. They just get upset. Like, we're totally expendable to these other gods. Moses is saying without reservation, We are made in God's image. We are made for a purpose. He deeply cares for us. Instead of an annoying afterthought, humanity is God's crowning achievement, made in his very image. Not only is our image unique, our purpose is unique as well. You see, in these pagan creation stories, Marduk or these other gods always design humanity to toil for the gods, but here it's the other way around. Over the first 5 days of creation, as incredible as this is, God toils for us. He prepares a place for us. He creates the earth, the water, the air, the plants, and the garden, providing us this environment with which we can flourish. He's getting ready for us. He's preparing for us. He's working for our good and on our behalf. In other stories, mankind is told to sacrifice children so that the gods can eat them, to spill blood so that the gods can drink. But in Genesis 1:29, we see the opposite. We see our God providing food and drink for us. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. Listen to me. This creation story, it may be similar to other religions and their creation stories, but our God could not be more dissimilar from these other gods. He could not be elevated higher above these pagan gods if Moses spent year after year and page after page and pen after pen writing about this. This is the crowning achievement. Like Moses writing this, it's the best position paper ever written. It's amazing. It's beautiful. He goes after them. These stories might be similar, but our God could not be more dissimilar. Moses makes sure that the people of Israel and every other person who would ever read this, and that includes me and you right here this morning, he makes sure that we know that Yahweh, that our God reigns supreme. Moses is not concerned with whether all this happened in 6 days or 6 seconds or 6 billion years. Moses doesn't care if God made everything fully formed or if he set evolution into motion. Moses is saying, when our God commands, it is always so and it is always good. Moses is shouting, when our God speaks, his will is done. That's what he's concerned with. Genesis 1 isn't an explanation of how old the earth is. It's a description of how great our God is. It's not a historical recounting. It's a beautiful picture of God's glory and his love. And I'm telling you that it's better. It's better. It's better than we could have ever imagined. He is better than we could have ever imagined. And that's where I want to end this morning. Meditating on the truth that Moses so carefully and explicitly presents here. That is, that God is bigger and better than we could have ever imagined. So we couldn't think of a better way to do this together than to sing a song called So Will I. You may have heard it here before. We've sang it a few times, but really take the next few minutes and meditate on these words. All about the greatness of God and our response to him. Listen, it doesn't matter if you stand and sing. It doesn't matter if you sit and read the words or if you kneel and pray. However you want to do it, just soak in this for a second. Just take it in for a minute. Because whether you've been a Christian for a long time or you're still trying to figure out what you really think, what you really believe about this God who claims to be the creator and sustainer of all things, wherever you are on your journey of faith this morning, this time is for you. This time is for you to reflect, for you to dwell, for you to meditate, for you to think. As I said at the beginning, if you want to talk more about this, if you want to have some spiritual discussions, we provide the space for you to do that in our Restore groups. After each week's message, we send out discussion questions. You can talk through those. If you're not connected to a group and you want to get connected, just go to the Connection Center right after the gathering ends. But right now, spend some time wrestling with what you've heard this morning. Before we start, I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray that God moves in our hearts and our minds during this time, and I'm going to pray that we really lean into it. God, thank you for your word from Genesis 1 this morning. Thank you that we don't have to settle for some halfway or half-baked version of who you are or what you've done, but we get to lean in to the fullness of your majesty, the perfection of your glory, and to your relentless love for us. God, move this from just bouncing around in our brains, help it penetrate our heart, our soul, our very selves. Stir our affections for you, God. In these next few minutes, help us to meditate on who you are and what you've done, your glory and your grace.